Nothing exists alone. Look up at a winter dusk and you might see it, a murmuration of starlings, thousands of birds turning as one, like a single living thing breathing across the sky. No bird is in charge. No bird can see the whole pattern. And yet, what you are watching is order, with no commander. Tonight, the Buddha noticed the same thing about you, about your own mind, and modern science arrived at the same conclusion from the opposite direction. If you have ever wondered how the experience of being you arises from a body and a brain and a lifetime of memories, and why that experience is both completely real and not quite what it seems, tonight is for that question. Because in the last 50 years, a handful of scientists studying networks, systems, and emergence stumbled onto a principle that the Buddha articulated in a single formula 25 centuries ago. That formula, that the whole cannot be understood from the parts, that everything arises from connection, fits in almost one sentence. When this is, that is. When this isn't, that isn't. SN 12.21. The Buddha discovered this 2,500 years ago. Scientists have been discovering it ever since. Chapter 1. The whole and its parts. In 1972, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist named Philip Anderson published a paper with a deceptively simple title, More is Different. Anderson was not a philosopher. He was a condensed matter physicist, someone who spent his career studying the behavior of materials at the atomic level. But he had noticed something that bothered him, a widespread assumption in science that understanding the parts was the same as understanding the whole. That if you could describe the behavior of individual particles with enough precision, you could predict the behavior of everything those particles composed. Anderson said, no. The behavior of large and complex aggregations of elementary particles, he wrote, is not to be understood in terms of a simple extrapolation of the properties of a few particles. Instead, at each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear. Entirely new properties appear, not more of the same properties, not a scaled-up version of what was already there, something genuinely new, something that did not exist at the level below. He put it even more sharply. Psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry. You cannot explain the behavior of a cell by describing its atoms, not because the atoms are wrong, but because the cell is doing something the atoms alone cannot do. The wetness of water is not a property of hydrogen. The meaning of a sentence is not a property of ink. At every level of complexity, something new enters the picture, and that something was not hiding in the components, waiting to be discovered. It was produced by their interaction. This is what scientists call emergence. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Consider those starlings again. In 2008, a team of physicists led by Andrea Ballerini set up cameras in the skies above Rome to study murmurations with the precision of a physics experiment. They tracked individual birds, mapped their movements, and asked the obvious question: how does the flock coordinate? The answer was startling in its simplicity. Each starling interacts with 6 or 7 nearest neighbors. Not all the birds within a certain distance. 6 or 7 specific nearest neighbors. That is the entire rule. No bird monitors the whole flock. No bird receives instructions from a leader. Each bird adjusts its speed, direction, and spacing based on what its nearest 6 or 7 companions are doing. And from that single, local rule, the entire murmuration emerges. Thousands of birds, one rule. And what you see from the ground, that extraordinary, fluid, breathing shape, is a property that belongs to the flock and to the flock alone. You will not find it in any individual starling. You cannot predict it by studying one bird in a laboratory. The pattern is real, it is observable, it is beautiful, and it does not exist at the level of the individual. A later study found that the number, 6 or 7, is not arbitrary. It optimizes the balance between the group's cohesion and each bird's individual effort. Fewer neighbors and the flock fragments. More neighbors and each bird spends too much energy tracking too many signals. 6 or 7 is the sweet spot. The point where the simplest local rule produces the most coherent global pattern. This is what Anderson meant by more is different. The murmuration is not a bird doing something complicated. It is 1,000 birds doing something simple. And from that simplicity, complexity is born. Now scale the principle up. In 1998, 2 mathematicians named Duncan Watts and Watts-Strogatz published a paper that changed how scientists think about networks. They showed that many real-world networks, social networks, neural networks, power grids, ecosystems, share a surprising structural property. Any node can reach any other node through a remarkably small number of steps. You have probably heard a version of this. 6 degrees of separation. The idea that you are connected to any other person on Earth through at most 6 intermediate acquaintances. Watts and Strogatz showed that this property is not a curiosity of human social life. It is a structural feature of how networks organize themselves. High clustering locally, short paths globally. Your friends know each other, but through a few long-range connections, your local cluster connects to clusters on the other side of the world. This means that in a network, influence travels farther and faster than you might expect. What happens in one corner of the system can reach a distant corner through surprisingly few steps. A rumor, a virus, an idea, a financial shock. Anything that moves through connections can traverse an entire network before the people inside it realize what is happening. The world, Watts and Strogatz showed, is structurally smaller than it looks, and that structural closeness has consequences. Consequences that become terrifyingly visible when the thing traveling through the network is a failure. A year later, in 1999, a physicist named Albert Laszlo Barabási added another piece. Barabási had been studying the structure of the World Wide Web, mapping which pages linked to which, and he noticed something the existing models could not explain. The connections were not distributed evenly. A small number of nodes had an enormous number of connections, far more than average, while the vast majority had very few. He called these highly connected nodes hubs, and he proposed, in one influential model, that this pattern arose from a simple mechanism. When new nodes enter a network, they preferentially attach to nodes that are already well connected. The rich get richer. The well-connected become more connected. This model has since been debated. Some researchers have found that the strongest version of this pattern is empirically rare across real-world networks. But the basic observation that hubs exist in many networks stands, and hubs matter. They matter because hubs make networks robust yet fragile. Remove a random node from a network with hubs and the system barely notices. The odds of randomly hitting a hub are low, but target a hub deliberately, and the effects cascade through the entire structure. The network that seemed resilient collapses. On August 14, 2003, a transmission line fault in Ohio cascaded into the collapse of power across the northeastern United States and Canada. An estimated 50 million people lost power. The cause was not a single catastrophic failure. It was a sequence. A sagging power line touched overgrown trees. A software bug in the alarm system at one utility company meant that operators did not see the warning. The failure propagated from node to node, through the connections of an interconnected grid, until an area stretching from Ohio to New York to Ontario went dark. 50 million people, one sagging line, and a network whose structure turned a local fault into a continental event. Traffic lights went dark in Manhattan, hospitals switched to generators, water treatment plants lost pressure across Ontario. The system did not fail because any single component was poorly designed. It failed because the components were connected, and in a connected system, a small disruption at the right node can propagate faster than anyone can respond. This is what it means to live in an interconnected system. The connections that make the system work are the same connections that transmit its failures. The strength and the vulnerability are not separate features. They are the same feature, seen from different angles. The popular story, itself debated by ecologists, goes like this. In 1995, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park after a 70-year absence, and something unexpected happened. With wolves back, elk could no longer graze unchecked in the same valleys. Vegetation recovered along riverbanks. Beavers returned. Streams stabilized. The presence of one species restructured an entire ecosystem. The full picture is more complicated than the popular version allows. Researchers continue to debate how much of Yellowstone's recovery is attributable to wolves alone and how much to other factors. But the core observation is sound. In a network of ecological relationships, a single node can have effects that ripple through the entire system in ways no one predicted in advance. All of this, the murmurations, the small worlds, the hubs, the cascades, the ecosystems, points toward a single conclusion. And it was stated most clearly, not by a network scientist, but by a systems theorist named Donella Meadows. Meadows spent her career studying the behavior of complex systems, economies, ecosystems, organizations, societies. And her definition of a system was deliberately simple. An interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. But the key insight, the one that changes how you think, was her corollary. Changing elements usually has the least effect on the system. You can replace every person in an organization, and the organization will behave much the same way, because the behavior is not produced by the people. It is produced by the relationships between them, the rules, the incentives, the feedback loops, the structure. Think about what this means for your own life. You have changed jobs, moved cities, replaced habits, ended relationships, and yet certain patterns persist. Certain reactions repeat. Certain dynamics reassert themselves in new settings. This is not a failure of willpower. It is the nature of systems. The elements change. The structure endures. The system, Meadows said, has its own logic, and the only way to change the system's behavior is to change its structure, its relationships, its feedback loops, the information it has access to. Tinkering with individual components while leaving the structure intact is like rearranging furniture on a ship and expecting to change its course. And that logic cannot be found by taking the system apart. It cannot be found in any individual element, any more than the murmuration can be found in a single starling. The behavior of the system emerges from the relationships, and it is the relationships, not the components, that you must understand if you want to understand anything at all. Two traditions of science, network science and systems science, arrived independently at this foundational observation. You cannot understand the behavior of a complex system by studying its components in isolation. The whole is not merely more than the sum of its parts. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. Philip Anderson reached this conclusion by studying materials. Watts and Strogatz reached it by mapping networks. Barabási reached it by tracing the architecture of the World Wide Web. Meadows reached it by modeling the feedback loops of global economies and ecosystems. 4 different starting points, 4 different disciplines, 1 convergent conclusion. Look at the relationships, not the components. The behavior you are trying to understand is produced by the connections between things, not by the things themselves. And here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because this observation, this hard-won, mathematically rigorous, empirically verified conclusion of modern science, was articulated 2,500 years ago in a forest in northern India. By someone who was not studying power grids or ecosystems or the World Wide Web. He was studying the architecture of suffering. Chapter 2. The Buddha's version. His name for it was Paticca-samuppada, dependent origination, and he did not claim to have invented it. This is a detail that changes everything about how you hear what comes next. In a discourse recorded as the Pakaya Sutta, SN RN 12.20, the Buddha made an extraordinary statement about the nature of what he had found. Whether or not there is the arising of Tathagatas, this property stands, this regularity of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma, that conditionality, whether or not there is the arising of Tathagatas, whether or not a Buddha appears in the world, the structure is already there, the conditionality is already operating. The Buddha did not create it, he did not design it. He, in the language of the text, directly awakened to it, broke through to it, and then he reveals it, explains it, makes it plain, and says, look, look, not believe, not worship, look. Compare this with Donella Meadows, 25 centuries later. The system has its own logic. Or with Philip Anderson. At each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear. These are descriptions of a reality that exists whether or not anyone describes it. The murmuration happens whether or not physicists set up cameras in Rome. The network has hubs whether or not Barabási maps the World Wide Web. And the chain of conditions that produces your suffering operates whether or not anyone teaches you to see it. The Buddha's contribution was not the creation of the structure. It was the act of seeing it, and then showing others where to look. This distinction matters more than it might seem. It means dependent origination is not a doctrine you have to accept on faith. It is not a belief system. It is a claim about the structure of reality, a claim that can be investigated, tested, observed in your own experience. The way gravity is not Newton's invention, but his observation. The way the pattern of 6 or 7 neighbors is not Ballerini's creation, but her discovery. The structure was there before anyone described it. It will be there after everyone has forgotten the description. The formula he used was spare to the point of severity. 4 lines, SN 12.21. When this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. That is the entire principle. No exceptions, no special cases. When conditions are present, results arise. When conditions cease, results cease. Everything that exists, exists because something else supports it. Nothing stands alone. If this sounds abstract, the Buddha made it concrete. In the Vibhanga Sutta, ESNETN 12.2, he mapped the specific network of conditions that produces the experience of being a suffering human being. 12 links, each arising from the one before. Ignorance conditions fabrications. Fabrications condition consciousness. Consciousness conditions name and form. Name and form conditions the 6 sense media. The 6 sense media condition contact. Contact conditions feeling. Feeling conditions craving. Craving conditions clinging. Clinging conditions becoming. Becoming conditions birth. Birth conditions aging and death. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. Such is the origination of this entire mass of suffering. 12 links, one chain, and the critical feature is not any individual link, it is the architecture. Each link arises because the previous link is present. No link stands alone. No link is the cause of suffering by itself. Suffering is what the whole chain produces, the emergent property of 12 conditions operating together. Notice what this is not. It is not a simple cause and effect sequence. A cause is B, end of story. It is a network of conditions, each one necessary, none sufficient alone. Ignorance does not cause suffering the way a match causes fire. Ignorance sets up a condition, fabrication, which sets up another condition, consciousness, which sets up another and another and another, until the full pattern of suffering has assembled itself from 12 interlocking pieces. Remove any condition, and what depends on it does not arise. The system, as Meadows would say, has its own logic, and that logic runs on conditionality, not on any single commanding cause. You have heard this word before, emergent. The murmuration is an emergent property of 1,000 starlings following a simple rule. The blackout was an emergent property of a grid whose connections transmitted failure faster than humans could respond. And suffering, in the Buddha's analysis, is an emergent property of 12 conditions linked in a specific sequence. This is where the Buddha's map and the map drawn by modern science converge most precisely. And where the Buddha's map goes, somewhere, science has not. Consider the 5 aggregates. The Buddha's analysis of what constitutes a person. S. N. 22.59. Form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness. These are the components. And the Buddha examined each one in turn and said, form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, fabrications are not self, consciousness is not self, not because the self does not exist, but because the self cannot be found in any single component. You cannot find the flock in the starling. You cannot find wetness in a hydrogen atom. You cannot find the meaning of a sentence in a single letter. And you cannot find the self, the experience of being you, the felt sense of, I am this person, living this life, in any one of the 5 aggregates. And yet the experience is there. You feel it right now. The sense of being someone, of having a perspective, a history, preferences, fears, a body in a room. It is as real as anything you have ever known. Here is a way to see it. Close your eyes for a moment and notice what is happening. There is a body, form. There are sensations, feelings, pleasant and unpleasant, arising and passing. There is a recognition of what those sensations are. Perception. There is a stream of mental activity, planning, remembering, reacting, that the Buddha called fabrications. And there is an awareness of all of it, consciousness. 5 processes, running simultaneously, each one distinct. And from their interaction, not from any one of them, arises the seamless, unified sense of, I am here, this is me. This is my life. That sense is not an illusion, but it is not what it appears to be either. This is emergence, not the strong version, not the claim that consciousness is some metaphysical mystery that can never in principle be explained. The Buddha was more precise than that. What he described is closer to what scientists call weak emergence, a property that arises from lower-level interactions in ways that are real and genuinely new, but that can, in principle, be traced back to those interactions. The key word is interactions. The property is not hiding inside the components. It is produced by the way the components relate to each other. Change the relationships, change the property. The murmuration is real. It is not a separate thing floating above the starlings. It is what the starlings produce when they interact according to their local rules. The self-sense is real. It is not a ghost in the machine. It is what the 5 aggregates produce when they interact according to the conditions of dependent origination. The Buddha held this with extraordinary precision. In the Kaccanagotta Sutta, S.N. 12.15, he said, "Everything exists, that is one extreme. Everything doesn't exist, that is a second extreme." Avoiding these 2 extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle. The self is not a fixed entity that exists independently of conditions. That is one extreme, and clinging to it produces suffering. The self is not nothing, a mere illusion to be dismissed. That is the other extreme, and it fails to account for the reality of your experience. What the Buddha observed was the middle, the arising and ceasing of conditions. The self is a pattern. It arises when conditions support it and ceases when those conditions change. Real as a pattern, not real as a permanent independent thing. What this means for you is both simple and profound. You do not need to annihilate the self. That is the nihilist extreme, and it leads nowhere useful. You do not need to defend the self as a fortress. That is the eternalist extreme, and it is what produces clinging. What you can do is see the self for what it is, a process, a pattern of conditions, arising and ceasing. No more fixed than the murmuration and no less real. This is the same insight Anderson reached when he said that new properties appear at each level of complexity. The murmuration is real. You can photograph it, study it, watch it take your breath away at dusk. But it is not a separate entity added to the starlings. It is what the starlings do together. The self is real. You experience it every waking moment. But it is not a separate entity added to the aggregates. It is what the aggregates do together. And now, here is where the Buddha went further than any network scientist or systems theorist has gone. Science can tell you that systems have emergent properties. Science can map hubs, trace cascades, model the behavior of complex networks. But science, at least so far, does not tell you which specific junction in the network of your own experience is producing your suffering, and it does not tell you what to do about it. The Buddha did. In the chain of 12 links, there is one junction that the entire contemplative tradition identifies as the critical intervention point, the step from feeling to craving. Contact with the world produces feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. This is automatic. You cannot stop it. A sound reaches your ear and a feeling tone arises. Agreeable, disagreeable, neutral. A memory surfaces and carries a valence with it. This happens before you have any say in the matter, but what happens next is not automatic. Feeling does not have to become craving. The pleasant sensation does not have to become, "I want more of this." The unpleasant sensation does not have to become, "I need this to stop." There is a gap, a space between the feeling and the response. And that gap is where the chain can be broken. You have experienced this gap, even if you have never named it. Someone says something unkind to you. There is a moment, a fraction of a second, where you feel the sting, the unpleasant sensation, before the anger or the hurt or the defensive reaction assembles itself. In that fraction of a second, the feeling is just a feeling. It has not yet become a story. It has not yet become, "They disrespected me," or "I need to defend myself." The craving, the urgent push to react, to fix, to escape, has not yet formed. In that gap, you are at the junction, And what you do in that gap determines whether the rest of the chain, clinging, becoming, the full cascade of suffering, fires or falls silent. This is not a hub in the strict network sense. Removing it does not collapse the system the way removing a hub collapses a power grid. It is something more precise, a breakable causal step, a junction where the automatic progression from feeling to craving can be interrupted by a specific practice. Satipatthana, the careful, sustained observation of feeling tones as they arise, before they trigger the craving that feeds the rest of the chain. Think of it this way. In any network, there are junctions where a small intervention produces large effects. Meadows spent her career looking for such junctions in economic and ecological systems. The Buddha identified one such junction in the network of conditions producing your suffering, the step from feeling to craving. And he provided not a theory, not a description, not an elegant diagram, but a practice, a method for working with that junction directly, in real time, in the texture of your own experience. Science describes the network. The Buddha identified the specific link where liberation becomes possible. And what is remarkable, what makes this story worth telling tonight, is that neither side knew the other existed. The scientists who mapped networks and modeled systems never read the Pali Canon. The Buddha, sitting in a forest 25 centuries ago, never heard of emergence or scale-free networks or cascading failures. And yet they arrived at the same structural observation from opposite directions, with different instruments for entirely different purposes. Two maps, one territory, and it is time to lay them side by side. Chapter 3. The Convergence. Here, then, are two maps of the same territory, drawn independently, centuries apart, by people who never met and never read each other's work. One drawn by scientists in universities and research laboratories across the 20th and 21st centuries. The other drawn by a man in northern India, 2,500 years ago, watching the conditions of his own mind. Let us lay them side by side. The first convergence is emergence, the observation that properties arise from relationships, not from components. Anderson, in 1972, at each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear. You cannot predict the behavior of a cell from the behavior of its atoms. You cannot find the murmuration in any individual starling. The whole is not merely more than the sum of its parts. It is something the parts alone could never produce. The Buddha, in the Anattalakkhana Sutta S.N. 22.59, form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, fabrications are not self, consciousness is not self. The self cannot be found in any aggregate, and yet the experience of selfhood emerges from their interrelation, as vivid and immediate as anything you have ever known. Both discoveries are the same discovery, made with different instruments. The scientist studies murmurations and power grids and neural networks and says, the system-level property is real, but it does not live in any component. The Buddha studies the 5 aggregates and says, the self-sense is real, but it does not live in any aggregate. Both are describing weak emergence, a property that arises from interactions, not from essences. Both are saying, if you want to understand what is happening, stop looking at the pieces. Look at how the pieces relate. The second convergence goes deeper, and it is the one that surprised me most when I first saw it. Donella Meadows spent years identifying what she called leverage points, places within a complex system where a small intervention produces a disproportionately large change. She ranked them from least to most powerful. At the bottom of her list, changing numbers, adjusting parameters, tinkering with constants. These are the interventions that feel productive but change almost nothing. At the middle, changing the rules of the system, restructuring information flows, altering feedback loops. These produce real change, but the system can often absorb them and return to its previous behavior. And at the very top of her hierarchy, the most powerful intervention possible in any system, Meadows placed something she could barely articulate in scientific language. She called it the power to transcend paradigms, not to adopt a better paradigm, not to replace one worldview with another, but to see that all paradigms are constructions, mental models that shape what you notice and what you ignore, and to step beyond them entirely. Now consider dependent origination. The 12 links begin with ignorance, avijja, and end with suffering. The cessation sequence runs in reverse. When ignorance ceases, fabrications cease. When fabrications cease, consciousness ceases. And so on, link by link, until the entire chain unwinds and suffering ceases. The highest leverage point in Meadows' system is the shift from one paradigm to another, and ultimately beyond paradigms altogether. The root condition in the Buddha system is the shift from ignorance to clear seeing, avijja to vijja, from which the entire chain of suffering unwinds. Listen to how Meadows described the highest leverage point: a falling of scales from eyes, a new way of seeing, in a millisecond. Now listen to how the Pali text described the moment of stream entry, the first glimpse of dependent origination in direct experience. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. In both cases, what changes is not information. It is not technique. It is not effort. What changes is the frame through which everything else is seen. And once the frame changes, everything downstream of it changes with it. Not because you pushed each piece into a new position, but because the organizing principle shifted. The system reorganizes itself around the new seeing. These are not the same thing. Meadows was analyzing how to save complex systems, economies, ecosystems, civilizations. The Buddha was analyzing how to liberate beings from the suffering that conditioned systems produce. She was trying to optimize the network. He was pointing beyond it. The goals are different, and the difference matters, but the structural observation is the same. The most powerful intervention is not at the surface. It is not about adjusting parameters or rearranging components. It is about changing how you see, changing the operating assumptions from which the entire system flows. Both frameworks independently identified that the deepest leverage is at the level of perception itself, and the parallels do not stop at the top. Meadows placed information flows, changing what information is available within a system, as one of her mid-level leverage points. Independent origination. This is precisely what Satipatthana does. It changes the information available at the Vedana Tanha junction. Feeling tones that previously operated below awareness are brought into clear view. Seen before craving has a chance to form. The practice does not remove the feeling. It changes the information flow around the feeling. And that change in information flow interrupts the cascade. Meadows placed the rules of the system one level higher. In the Buddha's framework, this is what samadhi, concentration, the training of attention, restructures. The rules governing where attention goes, what it clings to, how long it stays. Concentration does not add new content to the mind. It changes the rules by which the mind processes what is already there. I want to present these parallels honestly, as resonance, not equivalence. Meadows never read the Pali Canon. The Buddha never heard of leverage points. Neither framework was designed with the other in mind. What makes the parallels remarkable is precisely that they are unintended. The third convergence is the simplest to state and the hardest to internalize. Interconnection is not a feature of the world. It is the world. Meadows. Changing elements usually has the least effect on the system. You must understand the relationships. Anderson. The behavior of the whole cannot be predicted from the behavior of the parts. Barabási. The structure of the connections, not the nature of the nodes, determines the behavior of the network. And the Buddha in the Pakaya Sutta, S. N. 12.20. Whether or not there is the arising of Tathagatas, this property stands, this regularity of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma, that conditionality. Conditionality is not a theory the Buddha imposed on the world. It is a structural fact he discovered within it. No link in the chain stands alone. No condition operates independently. The isolation of any element, any aggregate, any link, any condition, is an analytical convenience, not a description of reality. Both traditions arrived at the same methodological conclusion. If you study the parts in isolation, you will miss everything that matters. The Cartesian program, understand the whole by breaking it into pieces, fails at every level of complexity. It fails for starlings. It fails for power grids. It fails for ecosystems. And it fails for the experience of being you. You have probably tried the Cartesian approach to your own suffering. You have isolated the problem. This job, this relationship, this habit, this fear, and tried to fix it in isolation. And you have probably noticed that fixing one problem often produces another, or that the same pattern reasserts itself in a new form. This is not a personal failing. It is the nature of systems. The suffering is not in the pieces. It is in how the pieces connect. And until you see the connections, the system will keep producing the same output. No matter how many individual pieces you rearrange, I want to be clear about what I am and am not saying. Barabási never drew this comparison himself. Neither did Meadows or Anderson. The Buddha never heard of network science. These are two maps drawn independently, 2,000 years apart, by people who never met and never read each other. No one is validating anyone. No one anticipated anyone. What makes the convergence remarkable is precisely that it was unintended. Two completely independent investigations, one looking outward at the structure of physical and social systems, the other looking inward at the structure of human experience, arrived at the same foundational observation. Nothing exists alone. Everything arises from connection, and the whole is always, irreducibly, more than the sum of its parts. Close where the maps diverge. But convergence is not the whole story, and if I left it there, two traditions arriving at the same conclusion, how remarkable, I would be doing something this channel has never done, declaring a winner without admitting a difference. The maps converge on structure. They diverge on purpose, and the divergence matters as much as the convergence. The first divergence is this. Science describes. The Buddha liberates. Network science and systems theory are, by design, value neutral. You can map the network of kindness and the network of exploitation with the same mathematical tools. Barabási's hubs appear in terrorist networks and in charitable organizations. Meadows' leverage points operate identically in systems you want to preserve and systems you want to dismantle. The description does not care what you do with it. Dependent origination is not value neutral. It is a description in service of a specific project, the cessation of suffering. The 12 links are not mapped so that you can admire the architecture. They are mapped so that you can find the junction where the chain can be broken. Every element of the Buddha's analysis, the formula, the 12 links, the 5 aggregates, the identification of the Vedana Tanha junction, points toward a single practical outcome: liberation. Meadows described the system so we could save it. The Buddha described the system so we could be free from it. These are not the same project. The second divergence: what to do with the self. Systems science looks at the self, the emergent pattern of consciousness, memory, preference, identity, and sees a fascinating complex adaptive system. The question science asks is, how do we optimize it? How do we make it more resilient, more adaptive, more effective? How do we strengthen the network, improve its connections, build better feedback loops within it? The Buddha looked at the same emergent pattern and asked a different question entirely. Not, how do I improve this system? But, who is the one who thinks they are running it? This is the question that separates the two maps at the deepest level. Science takes the self as a given, a system to be studied, understood, and improved. The Buddha's practice begins with the recognition that the self-sense itself is a conditioned process, and that identifying with it, treating it as a fixed entity that needs protecting and optimizing, is precisely what keeps the chain of suffering in motion. The liberation is not better self-management. It is seeing through the assumption that there is a manager. Systems science wants to optimize the system. The Buddha was pointing at the one who thought they were running it. You feel the force of this distinction in your own life. You have spent years trying to improve yourself. Better habits, better relationships, better management of your time and energy and emotions. And much of that effort has been worthwhile. But underneath all the improvement, there is a deeper question that optimization cannot touch. Who is the one doing the improving? Is that self a fixed thing that owns the system? Or is it part of the system, arising and ceasing along with everything else? The Buddha's answer is not comfortable, but it is precise. The one who thinks they are managing the network is itself a product of the network. And seeing this, not as a theory, but as a direct observation, is what changes the game entirely. The third divergence is the widest, and it is the one where science, honestly and honorably, reaches the edge of its map. Science says, understand the network, make better decisions within it, build more resilient systems. This is an enormously valuable project. It gives you weather prediction and ecological restoration and public health infrastructure and power grids that can withstand cascading failures. It gives you the tools to live more intelligently within the interconnected world you inhabit. And none of that is small. The Buddha said something else. Understand the network of conditions, yes. Practice satipatthana to interrupt the key junction, yes. But the endpoint is not a better managed network. The endpoint is what the Pali texts call nibbana, asankata, the unconditioned. Not a more resilient system, not a better designed network, not an optimized version of the conditioned chain, not a peak experience within the chain, the cessation of the conditioned chain entirely, a category that has no equivalent in systems science, because systems science, by its very nature, studies systems, and the unconditioned is not a system. Systems science has no concept for this, not because systems science is wrong, but because the unconditioned is, by definition, outside the domain of any science that studies conditioned phenomena. It is like asking a map maker to draw the territory beyond all maps. The question is not invalid. The map maker simply does not have the tools. Science is trying to improve the map. The Buddha was saying, there is a territory that no map can reach. I do not say this to diminish science. I say it to honor both traditions for what they actually are and what they are not. Science gives you the clearest possible understanding of the conditioned world, how systems work, how they connect, how they can be changed. That understanding is not optional. You need it. You live inside a network of conditions every moment of every day, and the more clearly you see those conditions, the more skillfully you can navigate them. But if you have ever sensed, even for a moment, that something about your experience cannot be fully captured by any description, any model, any system of conditions, the Buddha was pointing at that, not as a mystery to be solved, not as a problem to be optimized, as a possibility to be realized. Both traditions matter. You need the scientist's map to understand the structure you are living in. You need the Buddha's practice to work with the specific conditions producing your suffering. And you need the Buddha's pointer toward the unconditioned to recognize that the map, however accurate, is not the final word. The formula says it all. 2 movements, 2 directions. The first, when this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. S. Antra N. 12.21. This is the world you live in. The network of conditions, the murmuration, the cascade, the emergence, everything arising from connection, nothing standing alone. Ignorance conditions fabrications. Fabrications condition consciousness. On and on, link by link, until the full pattern assembles itself. Such is the origination of this entire mass of suffering. SN 12.2. That is one half of the formula. The half that science can see. The half that network theory and systems thinking have spent decades mapping. The arising of complex patterns from interconnected conditions. Science is extraordinarily good at this half. It can trace the connections, model the cascades, predict the emergent properties. It can tell you what arises when conditions come together. But the formula has a second half, and it points somewhere science has not followed. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. SN 12.21. When the root condition ceases, when ignorance gives way to clear seeing, the whole chain ceases. Not one link at a time, not through gradual optimization. The entire structure that produced suffering simply stops producing it, because the condition that sustained it is no longer present. Such is the cessation of this entire mass of suffering. S. N. 12.2. Nothing exists alone. Everything arises from connection, and when the right connection ceases, everything that depended on it ceases too. The formula has always pointed there, 2,500 years ago and tonight.